opinions about recovery, so I think that's a good way to start. The only thing I would add is under distinguishing the roles, I would add something about distinguishing the role as a recovery coach for younger adults. So it's specific to that because that's what the training's for. So that's all I got. Thanks.
That was great feedback. Thank you, Eric. Just to provide some insight there, that is not something that has been individually fleshed out in that section, which is a very important piece. Not only do we need to understand the role of recovery coaches across those different lanes, but also working with the younger population as opposed to an adult population or even minors. Thank you, Sasha. I appreciate that feedback. All right. So I see Catherine is typing, so I'll wait to see what she has to say, but then we can move on to day two. Wonderful. And Catherine, so Catherine said that she agrees about the safe spaces and the icebreaker placement. I like that self-reflection discussion of multiple pathways as early on. I have to say that it was one of our, I think it was our first virtual review. We got some feedback from some young people. I think we had that on day two. We had the definition of recovery maybe and pathways on day two instead of day one. So we switched that around. All right, so if we want to take the next, we'll say 5 minutes till 12:32 to look over day two. If you have anything that stands out, that's missing, that you like, and then we'll go over it as a group. Okay, Catherine, that was a great question to bring up. Wanting to know more about the issues of self-disclosure and what that might entail. And you're absolutely right. It does talk about sharing your story and the boundaries. But leading up to that part of the PowerPoint and the in-person training, we talk about boundaries first. We do different scenarios within the PowerPoint. We go over common scenarios and help figure out as a group where the boundary issues might be and what the right things are that we need to consider when dealing with those situations. So we build up to talking about boundaries, talking about the different scenarios where you'd have to be concerned about that, also having a good understanding about communication, which happens in the morning, and we kind of wrap that all up with your story and what you need to be aware of, how to share your story, giving some tips and pointers on, keeping your story brief, keeping it to, a point and having a purpose behind your sharing, and how to differentiate it between sharing in like a 12-step meeting as opposed to sharing it with a recovery. So we go in, it's a process that we get down to ending the day with, how does my recovery come into this? Now that I know more about communication, now that I know more about boundaries, now that I have an idea of how to navigate different scenarios, when is the best time to use my story and what do I need to be aware of? And I see Sasha's typing, but I'm just going to go over day 2 briefly. So we come back with the welcome and reconnect. We do huddles. So huddles and mingles is an exercise that's like notoriously connected to the RCA. You go around the room for the huddles and you're forced to talk to a stranger about anything, or maybe you get prompted with a subject, or maybe you're not. And then with the mingles, that's with the mingles. The huddles is where you come together as a group. So the point is of this exercise, really, if you're going to be a recovery coach, if you're going to be working with another peer, then you got to be able to engage in conversation and have that kind of service level conversation, also be able to dive deeper. So it's real-time practice. It also helps form relationships and build the trust. So we do that as a warm-up to get the energy going in the morning. And then we check in with the safe spaces. So on day 1, we would have created the working agreements on what we need to do in order to keep it a safe space. Day 2, we revisit it and we go over it again, ask if anything needs to change or be updated because it is also a working document. And then once we have that check-in, we begin the day and we go over the spectrum of attitudes, which is one of the foundational pieces of CCAR's work that they do around recovery coaching. And we have some great pieces within the day 2 training showing exactly what the spectrum of attitudes are. And it's talking about utilizing the recovery or the person you're working with instead of as, we use them as a resource. We view them as a resource. People in recovery have all the answers. They have all the potential. They have all the capabilities within inside themselves. And it's hard to make that adjustment, especially if you have a clinical background or you're coming from the rooms even, of looking at a recovery instead of as an object or a recipient, like they're receiving your guidance, they're receiving your wisdom and advice. As a recovery coach, we treat recoveries as the resource themselves, and we're just there to help them along, to ask them really good questions. So we go over that concept, which is a huge foundational piece of recovery coaching. So we have 45 minutes there, but it really bleeds into the rest of the training, and it's referenced many times beyond that. And then we move in from there to communication. We have another paper from Robert Ashford, who is a young man in recovery in the Philadelphia area, and it's like an updated messaging training, but he's written a white paper around it talking about where we are in the movement and where we need to go and the progress we've made and things to be mindful of when we're talking about ourselves in recovery and when we're sharing our stories. Then we do some PowerPoints over different communication styles, strength-based person-first language, take a break. We come back and we talk specifically about active listening, motivational interviewing skills, and we do some communication exercises. And this is where, when you start to see the 3s, this is where we're really starting to practice recovery coaching. feedback from the original RCA is that the training was great, but that attendees always want more opportunity to practice recovery coaching, just sitting and talking with somebody, asking really good questions, being curious, utilizing the skills that they're taught. So we've tried to build that in even more so here. So this is where it begins. We break up into groups of 3s and we have them practice. From there, we do getting your buttons pushed, talking about transference, countertransference, values, beliefs, reactions. So all that, it's kind of clinical jargon, but we've broken it down to be a little simpler and easier to understand. Even if we have formal definitions of the terms, we've translated it, quote unquote, translated it into simpler terms and easier examples to help people who might be younger, who might not have the educational background, who might not have the higher reading levels, to just be able to understand and absorb the information. And then from that, we go into lunch, come back again with mindful journaling or guided meditation, depending on the facilitator of the training. And that's where we start talking about the boundaries. We do personal scenarios, and then we come up with a personal kind of code of ethics for your own recovery and peer recovery coaching. And then we talk about sharing your story. We do a break from that. And this is where we do another group of 3. So this is where we're practicing recovery coaching. At 3:15, sharing your story continued, self-disclosure exercise. So now that we've learned the appropriate way to share your story, things that you want to avoid when sharing your story, we practice doing it. And then we wrap up the day with the art and science of recovery coaching, which is another fundamental piece of the existing Recovery Coach Academy and CCAR's belief system around recovery coaching, is that we can all learn the science or the skills that we need to learn, like motivational interviewing, active listening, what transference is, but there's also an art to recovery coaching, and we give that just as much power and praise, and we talk about the art that each person has. That's their lived experience. That's their ability to connect with another human, to be compassionate, and how powerful that is when talking about recovery coaching. We again do the pluses and wishes, and we close with affirmations. Does anyone have any feedback? Yes, Sasha, I see your question. Will the self-disclosure section address situations in which it may not be a good idea to share your story, and possibly different ways of sharing your story depending on the audience? That's exactly what we're talking about. Not something that is, I think, talked about enough, especially when you get people in recovery in more public settings, and now that there's some bigger cry to hear stories of people in recovery or who've struggled with addiction. That's exactly what we talk about. And when you're wearing the recovery coach hat, as opposed to just being a person from the recovery community or from being an advocate. We talk about the differences. There is a difference. You can be a recovery coach and also be an advocate and also be a counselor and also just be a person in your community. And depending on what the situation is, will affect how you share your story, if you should share your story, and what you would say when sharing your story. And I see Catherine is typing. For the sake of time, I'll visit your question if you have one when you send it. But in the meantime, I'm going to...
So, under the boundary section, what I'm curious about is when someone gets a recovery coach, I've heard of a scenario where the recovery coach and the individual, especially with younger people, agree to some sort of contract together, and the individual signs the contract, the recovery coach does, and maybe like certain members of the family. If that is something that's applied here, something like that, in the boundary section, I think it would be helpful to discuss when the recovery coach is required to disclose or report something that was shared with them. So, for example, I've heard in these contracts of if the individual, especially a younger individual, continues to relapse, then based on the agreement that they have, the recovery coach can then go talk to the parents so that they can get the individual back into treatment. So if that is something that's considered here, then I think discussing that in the boundaries, like when the recovery coach is required to go discuss what's been shared with somebody else, I think that would be important, because then it gives the individual, especially a younger individual, the impression that they're not just like best friends, and that anything that they share is automatically confidential.
Are you done, Eric? Okay, great. That was wonderful feedback. And so I've got two ways I'm going to respond to that question. One, just to set this kind of parameter out there. This training is a little more macro because it not only is it for general public to use this training however they want, but it's also a nationally and internationally recognized organization that offers these trainings. So we could have somebody in Kansas taking this training, and they have a totally different landscape around peer services, and we could have people here in New York taking this training where it's much more professionalized and increasing daily. So with the actual training, it's hard to drill down into specifics because we also have to consider where the recovery coaches are going to be working. Different clinical settings have different rules. Different structures have different ethics. Different states have different laws. So we can't be very specific. So as far as us maybe coming up with that kind of contract within the training, we can't do. But I think that's a great place. There is the recovery wellness plan that we offer and we adapted within this training. That is what CCAR has put out there and is connected to the Recovery Coach Academy. So that could be something that we make a suggestion in, having a specific contract around those kind of boundaries. When do we include somebody else? There is guidance in the boundary section about like a crisis situation, about when you're concerned about if it's high risk. High risk is a whole section of this, how to deal with high risk sections, different situations. And all of the guidance, check your organizational guidelines, report to your supervisor immediately. So there are certain responses that are the same across the board, no matter where the training is happening. But when it starts to get a little more specific about a contract around it, that's up to the agency to implement. But we could come up with some sort of guidance around that or make a suggestion within that recovery wellness plan that they'll be using. Have an extra page at the back. If you wanted to come up with a specific contract around like boundary issues, this is where you could incorporate it into the recovery wellness plan. Catherine, you bring up a great point. I'm just seeing your comment now about the nuance, thinking about how to navigate supporting someone with a different pathway in context of one's own story. And that really, we get into that quite a bit in day one, is understanding that, having that conversation in person, that we don't all have the same pathway of recovery. And it's okay to not even be fully supportive of other pathways of recovery, but it's important to understand what your personal biases are, and then you have to be able to make those decisions that if you are a recovery coach and you get partnered up with a recovery who has a different recovery pathway than you can support, then your responsibility is to be able to own that and admit that, and have them be partnered up with somebody else who can work with them equally. The reality is that there's so much divide. There's so much divide, and this is a huge issue that will continue to happen. And it's okay. Like, we're not going to change that through this training, but recovery coaches need to be cognizant of their own opinions, their own belief systems, and their limitations around that. And that's already touched on a bit in the existing Recovery Coach Academy, but we do go into it a bit more specifically, mostly in day one. All right, we are getting short on time, so let's hop right down to day 3. And if you have more questions or comments, you can keep plugging them into that chat box. So day 3, really, because we're short on time, I'm just going to go over this right now with everyone. We start off with the welcome and the reconnect. We do huddles and mingles. So we are working on both connecting individually and connecting as a group. We revisit our working agreements and make sure that the space is still safe and comfortable. And then we do this adapted power shuffle. So this is going to be the fun day. Recovery Coach Academy, the existing one, has the power shuffle, they call it, and it's an exercise around power differential and privilege, and understanding your own privilege and understanding how we've all been affected by it. So that exercise is a really big part of the existing Recovery Coach Academy, and everyone stands on one side of the room. The facilitator reads off a list of things. Have you ever felt like you were disadvantaged because of the color of your skin, or because of struggling with an addiction, or because you have a history of mental health illness, or what have you? And like with each topic, people walk across the room to demonstrate how many people are affected by that. So we've adapted it a bit to be, with different topics that we talk about, different issues that we highlight. It's the same exercise in its bones, but it's a lot friendlier to younger people. So that's how we start off the day. And that exercise takes a long time and can be, from my experience, just facilitating the Recovery Coach Academy. It can be a really profound and even emotional experience for people. So we break after that to give time people to cool off or talk to somebody if they need to, or just sit in that experience. And what we do when we come back from this, although it's not stated here, we're going to do a little bit of journaling too, just to help people process that a bit. And then another white paper we had written was from Chris Pallas, who's an attorney I think he's in the Maine, he just got past the Maine bar, but he's living in Texas right now. He's also a great advocate. So he wrote a paper on race and privilege in recovery. So we'll have that available. We'll reference that quite a bit. We do it just a bit here in day 3, and then we have a whole section that you'll see later on for the online component around this. So we talk about understanding power and privilege. We took a lot of the stuff for the in-person from the existing Recovery Coach Academy, and we dove a lot deeper for the online stuff. We do some exercises around exploring privilege. And then we talk about those high-risk situations, defining high risk, who you reach out to. If you find yourself in a high-risk situation, we do more scenarios with tips and pointers on things to look out for. And we talk about de-escalation skills, specific things you can do to help de-escalate a situation. And then we do more of those role-playing, using some of those de-escalation skills that we've just learned. From that, we break for lunch. We come back, we talk about recovery capital or recovery resources, defining what recovery capital is. Hunt the Good stuff is an exercise that we do, a group exercise around just identifying good recovery resources in that specific community. And then Ivana Grahovic, she works with Facing Addiction. She's a woman in recovery. She's worked a lot with young people in recovery in different organizations. She came up with a great exercise that we'll do around the healing forest and identifying your own recovery capital. And we talk about making referrals. How do you help, the role of a recovery coach is not to have all the answers, but a big role of a recovery coach is to be aware of the resources. So when you identified a need with your recovery, how do you refer them to the proper resource? And then we get into the Recovery Wellness Plan, which is from the existing Recovery Coach Academy, but we've adapted it to be more appropriate for young people. We talk about how to use SMART goals and set your own SMART goals. We have a break. We talked about self-care, the importance of it in your personal life, your professional life, and also how you can develop yourself in your career. And then we do our closing exercise. So the closing exercise on the final day in person is a bit different. We use the book to sit in a circle, go around, and we put our name at the top of our book, and then we pass it, and we write a good note, an affirmation, a comment that we've observed in the past few days about that person until everyone has written about everyone. And it's a great kumbaya kind of moment to close up these trainings. So we'll keep that as is. All right, does anyone have any feedback for day 3, the last day in? Okay, so because we are at 12:53, if you have comments or remarks that you want to make, please feed them right into that chat box. I'm going to move us down to the 2 days of distance learning, which will be, we've helped CCAR to develop an online learning platform. And again, like I said initially, there's going to be login information. You can set up your own account with them, and you can take various trainings online for CCAR. And there will be the 2 days of this curriculum. So you can log in, and you can either do it, it's going to be recommended that you do it before. You don't have to do it before, but you don't actually get your full certificate from CCAR until you've completed both the 3 days in person as well as the 2 days online. We also understand that some people can't make it to the in-person right away, so this gives them an opportunity to start the process of learning about recovery coaching from their home before they're able to actually come to training in person. So day 1 of the distance learning, we talked about really high level adolescent brain development. We talked about the different regions we talked about adolescent development and stages, the different stages of development that we go through. Really high level, not getting into a lot of details. It's not a college course, but just to kind of set the tone of helping a recovery coach understand cognitively where their recovery might be at, and especially where they might be at depending on when they started their addiction. And then from that, we jump into a little deeper of a dive into addiction in the brain, understanding how drugs impact the brain, the different regions of the brain, how drugs affect brain development, and also recovery and how that can help heal the brain. And then we go from there into the stages of change. It's Francesca Di Clemente just talking about, pre-contemplation, contemplation, all those different stages of change. And then from that, we go right into Stages of Recovery by William White, which is all part of there is a recovery peer exam through the ICNRC, which is the Internationally Accrediting Association for Addictions Counselors, peer service providers. So there is an exam, like here in New York, if you want to become a certified recovery peer advocate, you have to take that exam. So a lot of this information is stuff that you need to know in order to be able to pass that exam that might not have necessarily been in the original RCA, because the RCA was developed before that exam was developed. So now that that exam's out there and I've taken it, we're all more familiar with it, we've added in the pieces that are also in that exam that weren't included in the original RCA. Things like group dynamics, having an understanding about what you need to know within a group, running a group. Motivational interviewing, we touch on that a bit more than we did in just the in-person training. And then day 2, or the second part of the distance learning, we talk about ethical considerations. So we have, we had the other scenarios that we talked about in the in-person training, but here we talk about ethical considerations that you should be aware of, like online, virtually. If you're working with like Facebook, how to use Facebook or social media as opposed to being just a recovering person in your community, or if you're working in a professional capacity as a recovery coach, the things you need to be aware of. And we go into a pretty deep dive with cultural competency, going over many different definitions and kind of translating those definitions. You can see some of them listed here. That was pretty interesting. We got a lot of great information from Chris's paper, but we've had to work quite a bit on simplifying the language and trying to introduce some of the jargon around this, but staying away from it also so that it's easier to understand. That's actually the part that we're finishing up now. And from there, we go into race and recovery, which is, again, we're using a lot of resources, a lot of really great resources that are out there, trying to introduce it more into the recovery world. And then we talk about your rights as a coach. Another paper that we had written was from Doug Rudolph, who is another attorney in recovery. He's worked with YPR. He's one of the founding members of Young People in Recovery, and just a brilliant guy. He put together a long white paper about your rights as a recovery coach and connecting it to the ACA and kind of breaking it down so it's a little easier to understand, and talking about things like if you relapse and use, like how do you know like what your rights are, like do you get fired, can you not be fired, if you feel like you have been fired unjustly for something, where do you turn to for help? So we go over a lot of that in that section. And then we get into the different types of advocacy: self-advocacy, individual advocacy, systems advocacy. That's also something that is on the peer exam. And so that's the work that we're finishing up right now. Although it says 6 hours, again, that is really dependent on the person, because it could take, somebody can breeze through the adolescent brain development and addiction in the brain, I should say, but then have a hard time understanding race and privilege and cultural competency. Does anyone have any feedback on those before we run out of time? All right, so what I'm going to do, since there are several people who are going to join us and have not been able to join us, I'm going to email this same document out to all of you. And then when you get some time, and like maybe today, over the weekend, beginning of next week, if you want to kind of like scribble onto this document, like make notes in the cultural competency section, did you include X, Y, and Z? Or when you say systemic racism, did you talk about this? Or anything like along those lines. If I see Catherine just sent us a great message. If you're worried about the ACEs study or trauma, was it addressed in a certain area? If you want to provide us those kind of feedback, now is the time to do that, because by the end of this month, this is pretty much going to be finalized. So we have time to make adjustments right now, but we won't for very long. And you are all experts in your own right, so I value and appreciate any feedback you have to give, and will use it. We'll heed your advice. So we're at the top of the hour, and we don't have this room for much longer, so I'm going to wrap it up there. I see, Catherine, you have a great message, so I'll respond to that separately. But if anyone has any final thoughts, feel free to put it out there. If not, I will be following up with an email shortly. And thank you all for taking the time out of your Friday to make this.